coming.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, I'm delighted you're here. We have a talk tonight on lichen, and that's really exciting to me. It's the symbiosis between fungi and algae. How fascinating. Oh, yeah, but before we get to that, I want to tell you what's coming down the pike. Our next talk is about trees, the best way to manage forests given the science of trees. And then May 10th, we have, is that right on the, on the thing? Oh, good. Oh, wolves. That's an all-day, 1 to 5 afternoon. That is at the community center, and it's about wolves, from myth to reality. And the keynote speaker is from Yellowstone. So that should be interesting. You all know how we started, which was we came to the rescue of the 2013 flood. So we formed in about 2015 with $4.5 million to reclaim the waterways, the forests, everything. The trees were knocked down. And today we practice fire mitigation, which means basically removing the fuel source out of forests so that if a fire hits, it won't do the damage, it'll be containable. So that's what we're doing. Join us, please, if you can, or join our board. We're looking for board members. We'd love to have you. And with that, let me introduce our main speaker, who is Seth, help me with your last name. Raynor. He is getting a PhD in lichens, biology section, and he's going to talk about lichens. It's fascinating. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you all for coming. I absolutely love lichens, and I love talking about lichens, so it's a pleasure to be here. I will be mentioning my lab mate, Jacob Watts, and my advisor, Dr. Erin Manzitto-Tripp, throughout this talk, and I just wanted to go ahead and say all of this work is in collaboration with them. It would not be possible without them. Just an overview of what I'm going to be speaking about. I'm going to start with just a general lichen overview so we're all on the same page about what lichens are and the ecosystem services that they provide so we know why we should care about them. Briefly discuss Colorado as a biogeographical lichen haven before getting into the history of lichen research that's taken place here so far. Then I'll be discussing the lichens of the Indian Peaks Wilderness, which is just to the south of Rocky Mountain National Park. I wrote the lichen flora for that region for my master's thesis. And if there's time, a brief discussion about how successionary events affects lichens. Like fires, that was a great primer. So lichens. Back in 2020, if you would have Googled what a lichen is, Google would have told you it's a slow-growing plant. And that is just not the case. It's a composite organism made up of multiple species, primarily a fungus and an alga, but I decided to include the kingdom names for the groups of organisms that have been found within the symbiosis, and you'll notice none of them are the plant kingdom. So even though they're often grouped with the plants, they have no representative within them that is in the plant kingdom. This is only because before the advent of microscopes to be able to see fungal spores, they did not know how these reproduced. So lichens were lumped with bryophytes and other spore-producing plants into a group called cryptogams. You can split that up into crypto, meaning hidden, and gamete, meaning reproduction, because they had a hidden reproductive system. And these organisms are very slow growing, which often means they have a negative response to disturbance. In the bottom left corner, you'll see a very beautiful thallus cross-section from my lab mate, Jacob Watts. And it very nicely shows the normal layers within a lichen you'll see. This top clear layer is just what we call the cortex, and when it's dry, It's completely opaque, protecting the algal layer beneath from UV radiation. But when it's moist, it becomes translucent. And since you need water to conduct photosynthesis, it only allows the light to also get in for the algae to use when they're hydrated. So just to go over lichen growth forms, because sometimes these are confusing, there's three major ones, but as in all biology, there's variation, intermediates, and obscure forms. But the main three are crustose, foliose, and fruticose. And I like to explain these to people in terms of food. So fruticose lichens are very three-dimensional, just like a piece of fruit. Foliose lichens are very leaf-like, and they often have dorsiventral or two-sided lobes, like a leaf or a piece of foliage. And a crustose lichen, just like if you were trying to take the crust off of your kid's sandwich or piece of bread, when you take it off, some of the bread comes with it. These crustose lichens are so adnate or close to the substrate that it's impossible to remove them intact without taking some of the substrate with you. So when we're talking about collecting these rock lichens, we're using cold chisels, 3-pound hammers, hiking up into the mountains trying to find good specimens. Lichen reproduction is very interesting. There's like over 27 different modes of reproduction in lichens, but for the purpose of this talk, I'm just gonna briefly discuss 3. They can reproduce sexually through apothecia, where they form, just like ascomycete fungi, asci and ascospores within a hymenium that can be wind or water dispersed. But they also form asexual propagals. In the middle, there's Cervidia, which form these ball-like structures, and it's just a few algal cells contained within fungal hyphae. And what's great about these is when sexually reproducing lichens exude their spores, they have to germinate and find a single-celled algae that they can form the symbiosis with, whereas Cervidia and Isidia do not need that. Cervidia do not have a cortex around them, while Isidia, the cortical layer is continued through the upper surface, and they form more columnar shapes. Those can also increase surface area to help with water retention as well.
When you're talking about they have sex, what do you mean? There's fungi and there's algae. So what happens?
So so the sexual reproduction is more with the formation of the spores itself. If the spore is dispersed to a tree, and it's a tree-dwelling species, it'll germinate in suitable conditions, and that fungal hyphae will start going around the substrate, and it'll find a suitable algae. Now, it might not be the preferred algae, but as long as it's something usually from the same genus, it'll start to form its thallus. And what's weird is it's been shown that over time, the lichens can assimilate their preferred algae and get rid of the ones that they started forming with. The mechanism behind that's poorly understood though. So why lichens? Why care, right? Lichens are vastly understudied compared to the majority of macroscopic organisms, even though they provide an extensive suite of ecosystem services, including being instrumental in biogeochemical cycles, very important in both substrate creation. They're one of the first organisms to establish on newly exposed rock, whether that be from volcanic eruptions or from glacier retreating. They're also really important for microclimate regulation and stabilization, as well as food and shelter. And even though Colorado is an incredibly diverse and wondrous place, there is no treatment for Colorado lichens currently, only a few checklists and biomonitoring studies that I'll talk about here in a bit. So about the food and shelter, like y'all probably had a lot of mammal talks. For a lot of herbivores, during the winter, the plants here are gone, right? And they rely on organisms like lichen to keep from freezing to death during the winter. The shelter part is what I think is really interesting, and I've been working with a tardigradologist, sending him collections from around the state and from other regions, and he's been extracting tardigrades from them. And this tardigrade was actually extracted from one of the climbing areas in Estes Park, and genetic data shows that it's currently an undescribed new species to science. So lichens aren't just important for being like beautiful, cool organisms that provide ecosystem services. They also provide food to macroscopic organisms during the winter, and they provide shelter year-round to a lot of microscopic organisms. Yep.
And tardigrade, is it an insect or a?
It is not an insect. It has its own order. So insects are in Arthropoda, these are in Tardigradata. They're their own thing. They also are called water bears and moss piglets. There's not a common name for the lichens, so if anyone wants to suggest one, we're definitely open to taking suggestions. So far, the winner is lichen lambs, but we'll see about that. Also, for my bird people, there's plenty of lichens that have been shown to be used in nesting material. Some of the common examples are the golden plover using this Thamnolia, which I'm going to talk about here in a second, and then the red-throated hummingbird and blue-gray gnatcatcher. There's also been multiple studies that show certain lichen distributions globally match that of bird migration patterns, likely because birds sitting on a branch pick up those asexual propagals on their tail feathers and end up dropping them when they land in more southern habitats during their migration. Soil stabilization. This is out in Pawnee National Grassland. You'll be walking around on this really chalky soil, and your feet will just be leaving footprints the whole way because it's so soft. And where it's held together, it's usually because of these biological soil crusts that are normally majority made up of lichens. And then something I'm really interested in is their ability to sequester heavy metals and pollutants from the air because they get most of their moisture and their micronutrients from the atmosphere. This is an output from a device called an X-ray fluorescence machine, and what it gives is elemental composition. And I have it set on PB, which is lead, and this picture is from a lichen that I scanned, and then I flipped the rock over and scanned the rock, and you can see significant peaks on the lead for the lichen that are completely absent from the rock.
Wow.
So we know that the lead that we're capturing from the first scan is coming from the lichen. So Colorado. I moved here in 2022, and I'm really happy I did. This is a absolutely beautiful landscape. I love living here and studying the amazing lichens that are present throughout. It has really interesting biogeographical and evolutionary histories because of the overlap of multiple influences, whether it's species traveling down the spine of the Rockies, eastward from the western mountains, northward from the southern deserts, or westward from the plains and eastern temperate region. It's made a really unique vegetative community. And that mixed with the large elevational gradient and the diversity of habitats and microclimates lead us to hypothesize that the state will have high lichen biodiversity, even though there has been limited work here on that. So to talk a little bit about the biogeographical distributions, I was lucky enough to go up to Anchorage, Alaska for the 2022 Botany Conference right before I started my fieldwork on my lichen flora of Indian Peaks. And I knew I was going to go there, so I had species I wanted to look for. One of those being Flavocitruria nivalis. It was very easy to find, it's very common. The distribution map for it is on the right. And sure enough, the next week when I got back to Colorado from Alaska, the exact same thing. Another one I was interested in trying to find was Thamnolia, and I thought I found it. Distribution map on the right. This one has a really cool disjunction. I thought I had found it, but then I came into the alpine and it seemed different. Not only different habitat, but this was growing on the soil, it was prostrate, it had all of these very small thorn-like projections, and in general, just a wider gestalt. And it turned out what I collected in Alaska was only the 10th global record of Thamnolia tundrae, a very rare lichen. So it's not always one-to-one, but at least the genera that are often found in the Northern Rockies and in the Alpine can be found as far south as here, and it's often their southernmost distribution. So getting into the history of stuff that's happened here with lichens, the first report of lichens in Colorado came in the 1800s in plant papers mainly, looking at different floras. And it wasn't until 1935 with the publication of Bruce Fink's Lichen Flora of the United States that a lichen publication included Colorado specimens. And even further, in 1957, Imshog published alpine lichens of Western United States and adjacent Canada, which I used quite a bit for my thesis. But really, lichen research in Colorado started with two men, William Weber and Sam Shushan, two professors at the University of Colorado Boulder, where I'm currently doing my research. And they started out with this Lichen Flora of Colorado, in 1955, and they're working on like 4 genera, and they said, this is gonna be a series of papers, we're gonna be publishing and figuring out the flora. There was only one more of them, and only Weber published it by himself, no other publications, and they stopped really pursuing it after that, likely due to how difficult it is to understand. Luckily, they found a student, Roger Anderson, and him and Sam Shushan began to start this catalog of lichens of Colorado, which is really what we had our baseline diversity when myself and Jacob moved here to start this project with Erin. And he published extensively on lichens in Western North America before he unfortunately passed away at kind of an early age. They had some pretty good students. Mary Burt Carmer was Roger Anderson's student after he finished his PhD at the University of Colorado Boulder. He became a professor at CU Denver. And Mary Burt worked on bark-dwelling lichens in riparian areas in the Front Range, as well as working on additions to the Colorado lichen flora. And then Joanne Flock was one of William Weber's students, and she was working on Niwot Ridge, looking at lichen and bryophyte distributions, and how they change on a soil moisture gradient and how different levels of snowpack affect them. The 80s and 90s kind of took a down dip in research and was mainly focused on biomonitoring studies, which is kind of cool. And you see patterns globally with these. This was a study, the figure on the right showing a study from the UK. And these Xanthoria-esque species and Physcia species were found to be the most pollutant tolerant. And I can walk out in my apartment parking lot right now and you will find the exact same genera, showing that there is some species that tend to be more tolerant of human disturbance and these pollutions. And then finally, the modern research. There was a really great lichen flora done mainly in the San Juans and a little bit of the Rio Grande, where they found 316 species and 33 state records. If you are looking to dip your toe into lichens, but you're not sure how far you want to go, I'd highly recommend Larry St. Clair's Common Rocky Mountain Lichens. It only has a fraction of the biota here, and it's using old nomenclature, but it's definitely a good introductory book to the lichen biota, and Larry's a great scientist. Ann Hinson in 2013 published a paper on lichens on granitic rocks in Rocky Mountain National Park, and then my advisor, Erin Tripp in 2020 wrote a field guide to the lichens of white rocks, which is a really special geologic formation found in Boulder County. And that leads us to the big issue. We're in Colorado, highlighted by this purple box, And we have to use resources to identify our lichens. What do we have to use? We have lichens of the Pacific Northwest, lichens of the Sonoran Desert, lichens of the Black Hills, and Ozark lichens. And if y'all have been to any of those regions, you'll know that environmentally and habitat-wise, they are very different than Colorado. But we have to make do, and it often takes using multiple resources and keys from primary literature and just hoping that all of them converge on a single name. And it often does not, making this a very complicated issue. So the goals for our lichen team are to increase the understanding of regional diversity. We want to know what species are in the state and how to differentiate them. We're mainly going to be doing this by conducting lichen inventories of intact habitats across Colorado. I have an affinity for wilderness areas, but all public lands that we can get permits for are definitely going to be collected in. And we study them morphologically, chemically with thin layer chromatography, and when needed, genetically, doing ITS sequencing. And our end goal is to write the first complete treatment of the lichens of Colorado. The thing that's hard is where to start. The state has no shortage of public lands with 11 national forests, 2 grasslands, 4 national parks, 8 national monuments, and 42 state parks. But luckily, myself and my labmate Jacob came around at the same time, and we started some projects in tandem. He started a project in City of Boulder open space and mountain parks, and he's not only doing an inventory, but also made specific plots and tried to collect everything within the plot to actually compare the differences in the environmental factors within the plot and how they're affecting the lichen community that exists within it. And I started my lichen flora of the Indian Peaks Wilderness. So I'm sure most of you know about it, but the Indian Peaks Wilderness is a beautiful wilderness area whose northern border is Rocky Mountain National Park's southern border. It's about 120 square miles and nestled in the center of the Front Range Mountains. It has an elevational gradient of 8,400 to 13,500 feet and mainly consists of mixed conifer forest and alpine tundra. My primary goal was just to conduct a regional inventory and produce a species checklist for the wilderness. But I had secondary goals to document new records for the state, look for patterns in the diversity I saw, and hopefully describe a few new species to science. So here's a map of Indian Peaks Wilderness. My blue diamonds here are my collections from 2022, and red sites, so I collected everything that was different at the site. And then the reds were my collections from 2023. And in collaboration with Jacob and Erin, we collected a total of 3,620 novel vouchers. And these sites encompass a wide variety of different habitats and landscape assemblages. In addition to our novel collections, we studied 217 specimens at the Colo Herbarium at CU Boulder. And in total, they combined to give us 496 species within the wilderness, and an additional 41 found just outside the wilderness in the bordering national forest lands. This includes 34 state records, 4 species new to science, and 2 new to North America. You have a question?
They move based on the wind, spores do?
Wind and water.
Wind and water. And is there any, what do you call it when they like each other?
Hybridization?
Yeah.
It's poorly studied. Some groups have been shown to hybridize though.
Okay.
What's interesting is this, 537 species at time of completion represented 59% of the known Colorado lichen biota in a piece of land that represents only 0.1% of the Colorado landscape. This should not make you think, oh, Indian Peaks is the end all be all. It is wonderful, it is special. The rest of the state is that undersampled. And that's why we need to get out there and inventory as much of the state as we can, because if this 0.1% of the land gave us 4 new species to science, 2 species new to the continent, and 34 species new to the state, the rest of the state will likely give us much more. And the species we found there range a wide variety of colors, forms, and substrates, all of which I think are incredibly fascinating. And I promise there won't be too many graphs, but just to get through the first few, I was really interested in the difference between the sides of the continental divide. So on this left column, you'll see there was 185 species found on both sides of the divide, while there was around 311 that were unique to either the east or the west slope, with about the same from each, showing that one side of the divide was not more diverse than the other, but there does seem to be differences in what species exists on each side. For ecological life zones, the subalpine was by far the most diverse. I will say, I believe the montane having low values is slightly an artifact of that being the smallest represented life zone in the Indian Peaks wilderness, but work like Christy McCain's work has shown that mammals and invertebrates follow a very similar distribution where the middle elevations are the most diverse. And then looking at substrate and growth form, there's a lot of rocks, right? So usually where you are, substrate diversity and availability will drive this. So it is no surprise that the rocks are the most. And then you have the alpine tundra with those beautiful meadows. It is not surprising that soil has the next most. If we're in the Southern Alps, Southern Appalachians, and you have all that tree diversity, this bark diversity would be huge, and wood would probably also come up pretty high. And then growth form, the crustose lichens, by and large, regardless of where you are, this crustose growth form is going to be the most diverse, and unfortunately, it is also the least studied, mostly because it's difficult to study them. Yep.
So some of the lichens are growing on mosses?
Yes, there are plenty of moss-dwelling lichens. And we'll talk about a handful of these now. So just going through it, just to share terminology, we have special words for different things that dwell on different substrates. So we have the saxicolous, or the rock-dwelling lichens, and I'm just going to provide a few common examples of each. Rhodoa oroctica, you'll see more in the alpine to upper subalpine, but Dimelenorrhina and Rossovskia elegans you could see throughout the state. There's great representations of both of those species on Boulder campus. And since this is a watershed group, I thought it would be fun to introduce the fact that there's aquatic lichens. This one, Varicaria hydrella, was one that we did find in the Indian Peaks, which is really cool. If any of you see this, contact us. It should be here, but there are no records in the state. It's throughout the northern Rockies. It's even in the Northwest Mountains as well. But it's beautiful, it's leafy. You can see it from outside of the water easily. So if any of you see this, contact me. I would love, you would make my day. You'd probably make my year, honestly. But going back to the different substrates. The moss-dwelling lichens, or muscicolous lichens, they normally grow on dying mosses. There are some examples of species that grow only on living bryophytes, but a lot of them grow on these dying mosses. And some of the most common species we see are Diploschistes muscorum and Fisconia muscagena. This Bryoplecca younger absolutely beautiful with those gorgeous orange discs, is only really a alpine thing.
Can you point what's the lichen and what's the moss?
Yeah, so the moss is actually underneath. I don't think there's any visual moss on this one, but there's moss right here. This is the lichen.
The white.
Yep, and then over here, we have like mosses and alpine plants coming around, and then this is the lichen, and these orange discs are those apothecia that reproduce sexually. Over here, these have concave discs that sit immersed in the thallus for its apothecia. There's ground-dwelling lichens, like Seroma hypnorum and that Thamnolia subuliformis I brought up. And then we have weird cases like Xantha Parmelia wyominica that is actually unattached to the ground at all. And this is what we would usually call a vagrant lichen because it's unattached. They can be considered tiny tumbleweeds being blown in the distance. But recent studies have actually showed if you cut this in half, there will be a tiny pebble on the inside. So it's actually what we would call an erratic. It likely starts growing on a rock, establishes, and then encompasses it. And then it just visually looks like a vagrant lichen. We have multiple species of vagrant lichens throughout the state. And if we have time for the successionary stuff, I'll be talking about some vagrants that I studied in Florida. There's the corticulous lichens, or the bark-dwelling lichens. You'll see these throughout, especially the montane and subalpine forest, because that's where our trees are. Vulpista pinastri, really great epithet. Melanohalea subolivacea. This gets its genus name from the pigment melanin. It has the exact same pigment that human skin does, and it has the exact same use. It's for protecting against UV radiation. And then Xantha mendoza montana, one of the most common foliose lichens that you'll see, especially on aspen branch scars, which is what this is. This is like aspen bark beneath. The aspen bark is usually too smooth for most of the lichens here, and they'll be concentrated on those branch scars when you are looking at the aspens. The topography of it gives them more to hold on to. And then different species only grow on wood or on lignum, so they're called lignicolous fungi. Lecidella euphorea, when you cut into this, it has a beautiful teal epihymenium, which is the top layer of the apothecia. We have Parmeliopsis hyperopta and Xylographa parallela, which these are still apothecia. They're just formed in they have linear forms called larellae, but they're basically the same thing as apothecia. And then something I've been really into lately is the lichenicolous lichens, because of course they can grow on each other. Here's a really great example of Rhizocarpum figuratum in the middle, this pale yellow, growing over top Pleopsidium flavum, this bright, vivid lemon yellow. And then there's also examples of non-lichenized fungi parasitizing lichens. These tan discs are a species known as Biotropsis hirtae, and it's growing on this Usnea hirta. And Usnea hirta is a pretty common lichen you'll see throughout the Front Range foothills and into the montane regions. A special lichen, new to science, that we described, Saria syrindocarpa, is actually not a lichen. It's a non-lichenized fungi, but these orange discs are very reminiscent of species in the Teloschistaceae, which the Bryoplaca from earlier with those orange discs, when we were looking at the moss-dwelling lichens, is in. And because of their visual similarity, these have almost always been treated with other lichens. The epithet we chose, syrindocarpa, means orange inner fruit because of this very beautiful orange pigment that is visible when you cut into it. Its closest relative, Saria resinae, is completely white on the inside, and when you put it under a microscope, it looks clear. And it has polysporous asci. This is it in iodine. The asci, which contain the numerous ascospores, react blue in the iodine, which often is a character we use to help identify lichens. It's only known from 2 collections at the moment in the Indian Peaks Wilderness. I actually think my lab mate Jacob collected a 3rd, but it appears that they're only found near alpine or subalpine lakes. One specimen's actually from sheltered crumholes, which is pretty neat. And other than having the orange inner fruit, it has larger discs, smaller asci, and smaller spores than its closest relative. Another new species, Polycoliona pancakea, named after our incredible companion and field assistant Pancake. Even though she tries to steal our stick specimen, she is still a great field assistant. It's known from 4 total collections, 3 of which came from the Indian Peaks Wilderness. The type specimen is from Hell Canyon, and she was out with us on that day in Hell Canyon, and I have no clue how she made it up that mountain, but she 100% deserves a lichen named after her. It's related to other polycolionas, but what's really interesting, the thallus, instead of being a continuous crust, it's made up of these individual granules, which I have a nice picture of here. And you'll see the handful of algal cells being surrounded by about 1 or 2 cell thick layer of fungal hyphae. And I know I said there's 3, you just can't see the other one because it's also from Hell Canyon and being obscured by that left point. And just to show some other interesting ones, Valiella spanove, another new species. I haven't decided on an epithet for it. It has unique chemistry and honestly looks like nothing else we have here. Currently working on that description. A new Allocetraria, I'm probably going to call it dimorpha because it has similar characteristics between the 2 species that were already known from here. And then this gorgeous Lecanora expersa, my labmate Jacob wrote a paper about this one. This was one of the species that was new to North America and was previously only known in Europe. Cool, and I think, what are we doing on time? We're good? Okay, cool. We're gonna shift gears a little bit. So that was my general lichen inventory work and what I did for my master's. But as I'm moving forward, I'm also trying to clean up old projects and think about what I want to work on in the future. And I really think that successionary forces and how they impact lichens is interesting. Before I started studying lichens, I did taxonomic botany and fire ecology. And when I started studying lichens, I immediately wanted to know more about them. And now that I'm in Colorado, where historically the mountains didn't see fire for almost 100 years or more, and this region is expected to experience between 300% and 400% increase with 300% to 400% increase in weeks with risk of very large fires. It's probably pretty important to study how these lichens are being affected because we know that they're slow growing and impacted by disturbance heavily. But it's really hard to study fire lichens in a place that has fire that infrequently and doesn't have really detailed fire records. But luckily, before I moved here, I was in Central Florida, which saw fire every 2 years or less, is also expected to have a high increase. But the difference between these 2 regions is the biota in this region evolved with those environmental pressures, whereas the ones here did not. So they are not adapted to survive those pressures. But to talk a little bit about what I learned in Florida, just to set the stage, when Florida first emerged out of the ocean, it was just a series of sand dune ridges. And as the ocean rose and fell, the peninsula would get wider and occasionally get so narrow to create individual islands that caused geographic separation. The first of them to come out of the water was the Lake Wells Ridge, which is where I was. And this Lake Wells Ridge has a bunch of fire-maintained habitats and has been an absolute powerhouse in endemism. There's 23 plants, 4 animals, and 40 invertebrates that are only found on this one ridge across the globe. And they're very different communities, right? Here in Colorado, we have that big influence from the Canadian Rockies and the Arctic, from species traveling down the spine to escape glaciation, and things coming up from the north from the arid southwest. Florida has a huge tropical influence and has a ton of representatives from eastern temperate regions. Doesn't mean they're not beautiful though. Lichens are beautiful everywhere, just different communities. So this is the habitat I was working in. It's called rosemary scrub habitat. This is the rosemary shrub, Florida rosemary shrub, Ceratiola eriocoides, and it has an allelopathic relationship with its environment. It sends chemicals into the soil, which makes it hard for other plants to grow near it, which leaves this xeric moonscape of sand, which is perfect for those vagrant lichens I was talking about earlier. So these tiny tumbleweeds will grow until they can't support their weight from their size, and they'll be wind dispersed through the scrub ball and will keep growing and persisting. And this includes Cladonia prostrata, which is one of only 2 lichen species on the federal endangered species list. It's not the rarest lichen species I know. It's hard to get the federal government to care about lichens. That's the difference. So here's 8 of the 9 vagrants, and then just to show other species, here's the last of the vagrants that was in that group. And then I also studied a few species that grow on Serenor repens, which is a very cool palm. The individuals of that palm have been shown to live up to 10,000 plus years. Some of the oldest single individual organisms in the world. And they've given up the lifestyle of growing a tall stem and just trail along the ground. So just briefly to push past it, this is a map of Archbold Biological Station. It was the biological station on the Lake Wills Ridge I was stationed at. And these points represent my plots. And we stratified the plots across time since fire, fire severity, and latitude to make sure we were accounting for all the variation in those metrics. I would drop a pin at the coordinates and then run a 1 meter transect in the 4 cardinal directions. And for every millimeter, I would note exactly what the ground cover was, whether it was lichen, leaf litter, sand, subshrubs, or wood, and if it was a lichen, I would identify the lichen. And when we ran the analysis, we saw a very clear trend with lichen regeneration as time since fire continues. There wasn't as much trend for fire severity because even in low severity fires, lichens have high fire mortality. But regardless, it shows that the sooner a disturbance event happened, the less lichen abundance you'd have. And we plotted diversity as well, and the exact same trend showed up. So what does that have to do with us here in Colorado? Fire in Colorado is fast, it is extreme, it is intense, primarily because of the dry climate, and it's only getting more extreme with climate change. And these fire events lead to local extirpation of the lichens. I can tell you firsthand when you go to somewhere like the Zirkles that got completely decimated by a fire, the lichen diversity there compared to the lichen diversity in the Indian Peaks wilderness is visually noticeable. And these, like I said earlier, because the fire regime here was much longer than it was in Florida, these lichen communities are not adapted to withstand fire, so they have an even higher risk of local extirpation. But this has not been studied at all in Colorado. We don't know what lichens recolonize directly after fire or in the decade after fire, and we don't know how long it takes for full recovery. Likely 100 years or more. What's great about Colorado is fire is not the only successional driver that we can look at. We can also look at glaciation. On the left is a nice diagram from Talinko et al. 2020 showing the Pinedale glaciation. It was part of the Wisconsin time glaciation with the last glacial maximum with these large ice sheets, but because the glacier formations were separate from those ice sheets, they get their own name and are considered different. And you can see from their projected map, they have this continuation throughout where White River National Forest is all the way north up through the Front Range, and then a really big glacier down near the San Juans. And we still have remnants of those today. And I think it would be really interesting to see what the differences are between the communities, between pre-glacial landscape formations and post-glacial landscape formations. And with practice, you can actually see exactly where the glaciers were. So pre-glacial landscape formations often are formed with these nice gradual sloping rolling hills. This on the left is Niwot Ridge, and on the right is the, I believe this is Lake Granby, and this is a really cool, unique sagebrush steppe habitat that's not found anywhere else in the wilderness. But this very gently sloping, gradually rising landscape, very diagnostic of these pre-glacial landscape formations. In contrast, you have the glacial landscape formations, where the glaciers grew and then gouged out the landscape. On the right, this is Arapahoe Glacier with the Arapahoe Glacier Cirque. I believe we were on North Arapahoe Peak when we took that. And then on the left, this is Lone Eagle Peak on the west slope with multiple snow-packed areas where glaciers probably once stood. And then the last accessionary thing I'll talk about is the stand-level tree blowdown. And I'm sure you have all seen this and you're all worried about it. I know I am, and I just moved here. It happens mainly because the trees are getting weakened from a combination of pests and diseases. And at least for me, y'all might be more educated on this topic than I am, but I always hear people talking about bark beetles. But recent studies have shown that it's actually the western spruce budworm that is the most common pest and is probably the largest driver. This is probably making the tree more susceptible to other pests and to diseases like fire blight and cankers that are induced by fungal infections. So just to give a summary, there's been limited lichen work so far in the state of Colorado, but we are currently pursuing the creation of the first complete lichen treatment. This will mainly be done by conducting inventories of intact habitat and writing treatments for certain groups and descriptions of new species. The biota from other regions can be really pertinent from our study, so people's past work in places like the Greater Sonoran Desert in the Pacific Northwest and the Arctic are a great baseline from us to build off of, and successionary events that are currently happening in Colorado and that have happened in Colorado's past have played a big role in the state's current diversity. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne nations as the original stewards of this land. I am very appreciative to be able to work here and live in this great state. My advisor, Erin Manzitto-Tripp, and labmate, Jacob Watts, I really couldn't do anything I do without them. They are the best teammates I could ever have, and of course, Pancake the lichen doodle. My other lab mates, my cohort, all my friends at CU and the Colo Herbarium staff, our undergraduate sequencing team that we're gonna have to replenish because a lot of them graduated, the University of Colorado Boulder and its Museum of Natural History, and the U.S. Forest Service and Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest staff for providing permits, and all the granting agencies that have made our work possible, because without funding, we would just be a bunch of dirtbags traveling the state, trying to look at rocks, right? But luckily, other people have seen the merit in our work, and hopefully more people will, and we can continue our awesome research. Resources, and I'll take some questions. Yes.
I think a lot of us are familiar with field guides, dichotomous keys. I'm looking at lichens thinking, okay, what are the morphological characteristics that you use to identify a species, differentiate species in the field?
For sure.
Or do you not?
We do in the field, and I will say it's hard to make a field key, because in the field, we are mainly using Gestalt, and just because we've looked at thousands of them, and we've been in the areas and we know what to look for. If you are at home with a microscope, usually the things to look at are growth form, general color, and then cutting into it, looking at spore type, looking at chemistry is often really important. We look at chemistry through spot tests and just watching the color reaction happen by putting chemicals straight on the lichen. Or we'll take a piece of lichen, let it soak in acetone, which extracts the chemicals, and we'll spot that acetone solution onto a TLC plate and do what's called thin layer chromatography, which basically pulls those chemicals up a plate, and based on their polarity and more chemical reactions that we put it through, we can try to diagnose the chemicals. But it's a mix of micromorphology with like spore type, the type of ascus, when you cut into it, what does it look like, what the different sections are colored as, macromorphology, actual form, lobe size, areal size, if it's convex, if it's flat, all the normal things, it's just much smaller. I would say there's probably only 35 to 40% of the biota that you could, with any amount of confidence, name in the field. A large amount of our biota, you have to section it, and when we're in the field, we'll usually just call it a group, and we know what group it goes to, because like in our heads, like the key will take us to that group, but then we'll hit a character that you can't do without microscopy, or you can't do without a chemical test, and we're not out in the field dumping chemicals on things. Some people have said to do that, and I'm just gonna say not to do that.
Have the recent fires given you any opportunities to study? I mean, since the fires were in specific places and not nearby?
Right, the issue, yes, I've gotten to sample in places that have burned recently. The issue is that the precision of the fire mapping is much less than it was in Florida. In Florida, especially on that biological station, every 5 by 5 meters square of that biological station, you knew its entire fire history for the past 100 years, because they've been keeping track of it for over 100 years. Before it was through aerial photos, someone getting flown up in a plane and taking pictures. Now it's done with drones. So trying to navigate not knowing for sure what burned and what didn't, and if you're collecting an area that seems like it has a lot of diversity in a place that was supposed to burn, if you can actually know if that just avoided the fire because it was like a certain nook in the rock that it just went around or something like that, it's almost impossible to know. But I'm coming up with ideas. Yes?
Have you ever driven down 34, the Big Thompson Canyon?
Mm-hmm.
So when you get down toward the end and you are going through like the narrows,
Mm-hmm.
do you get distracted? Like, do you see everything on those rocks? Like, cause I do when I pay attention to everything and I'm always looking
Yep.
for the bighorns, but then I'm also looking at all the life and I'm like, oh my goodness.
Our cars have a sticker that says "I brake for lichens"
Oh,
on
I
them.
love it.
We probably drive a lot of people a little crazy, because it's definitely, I don't know if y'all have ever seen the field guide to roadside botany, but all the images are taken at 35 miles an hour, and it's just like blurs of pictures, and it's like, oh, it's a yellow aster, it's a yellow aster, it's a yellow aster. That's like what it feels most of the time. But like you said, every square foot of rock throughout this place is covered in colors and textures. And we have ideas that we might postulate that it is, but the names we're throwing at it are the most common. And no lichen is not interesting to me, but we're looking for the rare things, and that's the only thing that keeps us from probably wrecking our vehicles, is that we're like, oh, it's probably something common, don't look at it too much. Luckily, we're usually working in twos or all three of us together, so the person driving can drive while the other people are looking for spots. But there's been plenty of times that we've just pulled off rather abruptly to go climb up the mountain and look at some rocks.
Does lichen grow?
Mm-hmm.
And then center of it will die back? Is that what
For
happens?
some species, then you'll see like rings
Yeah.
where the middle is absent. But certain species, Usnea longisima in the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast, like Maine forest, can grow meters a year.
Oh, really?
Very, very robust species that can grow really fast. Other species grow less than a millimeter a year. So it's a wide range of stuff. Most of them grow in the range of millimeters or centimeters a year though, very small amounts. The best studies on growth rate I've seen have been on tombstones actually, because they provide reference points because of images or letters that you can use to be like, oh, it actually did grow this much. And it's kind of an interesting thing to do in an urban area. You can do lichens anywhere. It's really great. And year round, they're always in season. Yes, sir.
So how, like the common ones, like on a mass base in Rocky Mountain, you say 60–70% would be made up of how many species, the common ones?
That's a great question. Especially Rocky Mountain National Park. I've tried to get permits there for 3 years and they still haven't given them to us. As far as the coverage of the rocks, maybe locally common, maybe like 50%, 60% of the rocks are covered in common things. Maybe 30–40% less common. But a lot of the things that are common here are not common elsewhere. And a lot of things that are common here are only common like in the Arctic, for example, for those alpine species that are traveling down the spine of the Rockies, or they might be common in the southwestern tablelands or plateaus and deserts and are just barely reaching in here. So common versus rare kind of has a subjectiveness to it, and it depends on what level you're looking at. Like in the state level, a lot of it's probably rare, but if we're talking about nationally, I would expect us to not have a super high amount of endemism, but a very high amount of diversity because of all the different biogeographical histories that are overlapping within the state.
So how do they do in like super dry years, like when we had 2020 dry?
Super fine. Lichens have survived the vacuum of space. They can survive a dry year. Yeah, they're super fine. They are, this word's really hard to say. I'm gonna mess it up. Poikilohydric, but it means that they are used to desiccation, fully drying out, and then rehydrating. And that's why it's important that the lichens have that cortex layer that's opaque when it's dry and protects the algal layer from the sun when it's not actively photosynthesizing. If you have a little spray bottle, a little mister, next time you go out hiking, take it with you and just spray the lichens and sit there and watch, and they will change color right in front of you.
I did that in my garden in the night because I love moss. I'm a moss fan, and I'll be spraying the plants and stuff, and I'm like, okay, a little bit for you and a little bit for you, and everybody gets watered.
I love
So
that.
I wondered if, do they do better in more?
So certain lichens require wetter environments.
Okay.
For example, the cyanolichens. So most of the lichens here form their symbiosis with a green algae, single-celled green algae, a lot of them from the genus Trabuxia. But there's this group of lichens called the cyanolichens that associate with cyanobacteria. And they're really important because cyanobacteria can sequester atmospheric nitrogen and make it into usable nitrogen. So then when it decomposes into the soil, it gives usable nitrogen for all the plants. Those are almost entirely restricted to wet habitats, except for Encalema tenax, which you can find even in Pawnee National Grassland, which is about as dry as it gets here.
So our fireplace has a bunch of lichens on it?
Yes, I've seen this here, yeah.
So they're still alive?
Probably, it depends on how long it is.
100 years?
They might be. You could, if you have a microscope, you could cut into it and see if it still has its algal layer intact. If all the algae inside are dead, that's when you would probably say that the algae is no longer functioning, or the lichen's no longer functioning and might actually be dead. But usually we consider our specimens dormant.
So it sounds like are lichen found everywhere in the world, or are there areas that there are no lichen?
All 7 continents, there's one lichen, the Varicaria I showed, that's in freshwater. There's a species in that genus that's fully marine and has only been found on the ocean floor near one of the Antarctic peninsulas. So every habitat, every continent, yeah, they're everywhere. And they're some of the first species to establish, like I was saying, for new regions, new rock, new substrates. They're also one of the most conspicuous organisms in old growth habitats because of their slow growing nature. So once you get an eye for them, you will never stop seeing them. And every day will be more surprising.
Are they old in the whole scale of?
Like biodiversity, how long they've evolved. So for example, I'm just gonna, so I don't move too fast through these. This species, Dimolina orina, in the middle here, has a special place in my heart. This is the golden moonlight lichen. I've studied it a lot, as well as a lot of southwestern forms. That species probably should be 3 or 4 species, but we'll see how that plays out. It's proposed to be a Pangean relic.
Wow.
So that the ancestor to this genus, which is proposed to be most similar to Dimolina orina, was around during Pangean times.
Huh.
And that's supported by the distribution of its different chemical races, because it has different, what we call chemotypes. Morphologically, they look identical, but then when you do these chemical tests, certain ones in certain habitats have very distinct chemicals. For example, the ones in the high alpine will only have usnic acid. The ones in the lowlands, especially near Comanche National Grassland and the Spanish Peaks Wilderness, will have stictic acid. Everything in the eastern temperate zone will have fumar-protocitric acid. So there's like allopatric relationships and distributions between these different chemotypes of the lichens. But morphologically, this species is found everywhere from the Himalayas to here.
So, a couple of questions. First, like, how old can a lichen be? And then the second was just that if people want to learn more about lichens locally, we have on our Estes UVWC Loves Wildlife Facebook page, there's a blog on there the last week. And on the UVWC website, Estes Valley Watershed Coalition website, there will also, is it posted? There's a blog on lichens as well.
That's awesome. I'll have to check that out. Lichen age is really hard because it's mostly based on growth rates, but people measure growth rates in a specific region, and then instead of someone doing like lichen aging studies and making a new lichen growth rate for their region, they're often using a growth rate found in a different region. So I don't put too much weight in the aging pictures. In the aging studies I've seen, some of them are really old. You'll see large specimens here, and especially with these crustose groups, if you're looking at a really large lichen, and like large here, we're talking about this. Like if a crustose lichen's the size of your head, it's almost assuredly at least over 100 years old. And that's being really conservative.
100 years?
So you had mentioned many of the lichen are rock dwellers,
Mhm.
and as many of us sit on rocks and boulders, are we destroying them at that time?
Often, yes. Disturbance on high elevation rocky summits has been detrimental for a lot of plants and organisms throughout all of the world. Lichens are pretty resistant. People sitting on them isn't as big of a deal. A lot of these rock dwelling lichens prefer vertical cliffs, so it's more like rock climbing and landscape changes that are actually more detrimental to them. And then like the tree dwellers, deforestation, obviously the tree blowdown changing the entire landscape of the forest, those things hurt. But the places people go today, people have been going for decades. If we wanted to protect those surfaces, I think that time's a little bit past. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, but if you see one, maybe you would scoot over for it. Share the space.
This is really fascinating. Thank you so much. This stays. Okay.
Still, yeah, should still be on.
That's amazing.